An amazing conference, and as all of us know, really complicated. So many moving parts, so many different sessions. So really appreciate all your work. And also, thanks to you all for coming. This is the last session in a really long, I don't mean long in a bad way, long in a good way, but yeah, you've sat through a lot of talks and whatever, and really appreciate you coming tonight for this one. So my topic, as Morten said, is the politics of sound, and I want to begin by taking a step back to some preliminary questions about politics and the politics of art more generally, and to attune ourselves to this issue. I want to consider a poem by the Polish writer Wisława Szymborska, a poem that was first published in 1979 and that later appeared in the 1986 a collection, The People on the Bridge. It's a poem some of you may know. It's a poem called Children of Our Age, and it's just a few stanzas. I'll read it, and it'll sort of set us going for what I want to do today. So the poem's called Children of Our Age, and it goes, "We are children of our age. It's a political age. All day long, all through the night, all affairs, yours, ours, theirs, are political affairs. Whether you like it or not, your genes have a political past, your skin a political cast, your eyes a political slant. Whatever you don't say speaks for itself, so either way you're talking politics. Even when you take to the woods, you're taking political steps on political grounds. Apolitical poems are political too. And above us shines a moon no longer purely lunar. To be or not to be, that is the question, and though it troubles the digestion, it is a question, as always, of politics. To acquire a political meaning, you don't even have to be human. Raw material will do, or protein feed, or crude oil. Or a conference table whose shape was quarreled over for months. Should we arbitrate life and death at a round table or a square one? Meanwhile, people perished, animals died, houses burned, houses burned, and the fields ran wild, just as in times immemorial and less political." So I think Szymborska's poem is compelling for the range of attitudes that it encapsulates. In the first place, it conveys, I think with a degree of sincerity, a view that's common in intellectual discourse today. We hear it, we heard it a lot at this conference. I say this kind of thing all the time, that politics is everywhere and inescapable, evident in every human act, claim, and perspective, and extending into the natural world, viewed as a set of resources marked by human needs, desires, and projects. At the same time, however, the monotonous assertion of this claim and Szymborska's repetition of the words politics and political 13 times in 35 lines suggests that the phrase everything is political has become a platitude. Indeed, I think much of the poem reads like the set of truisms that artist Jenny Holzer began compiling in 1977, 2 years prior to the publication of Szymborska's poem. The tone of irony and tedium at the claim everything is political suggests that in discourse today, the term politics often misses the reality it's supposed to bring to the fore. Concerns suggested in the final stanza, matters of life and death, social order and destruction, and so on. The last few stanzas also suggest that though we may see it and hear it everywhere, politics is merely human, all too human. I begin with this poem both because I more or less accept the claim that everything is political, and because I want us to ask ourselves whether we really know what we mean by the term politics and the political, and whether what we call political really is so. Today, we tend to demand that works of art be political. In the age of Black Lives Matter, Me Too, growing right-wing nationalism, and catastrophic climate change, we tend to want artworks to engage with and reflect our social and political condition. And conversely, we tend to judge apolitical works to be irrelevant or reactionary. Of course, to be deemed political, a work of art need not demonstrate its political value or effectivity, but often only its political stance. And yet, as Jacques Rancière has pointed out, insofar as there's a consensus about what is political or subversive in art, such art is on the side of power and the police rather than of democratic politics. How then should we think about the politics of art? Taking sound and music as our example, I want to consider 3 different proposals concerning aesthetics and politics. We can begin with the most common idea. Music or sound is political insofar as it has political content or represents political issues, right? Think of all those great political songs that you know, that you grew up with, that you, or didn't, but think of, for me, things like Public Enemy's Fight the Power, or Bob Marley's Get Up, Stand Up, The Clash's Washington Bullets, Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, right? MIA's Borders, or more recently, Milk's Quiet, all kind of political anthems in different ways. However much we may love this music, the notion that music is political by virtue of its lyrical content has been subject to, I think, kind of withering criticism, right? In the early 1930s, Walter Benjamin pointed out that the bourgeois apparatus of production and publication can assimilate astonishing qualities of revolutionary themes, indeed can propagate them without calling its own existence and the existence of the class that owns it into question. And anyone who wonders whether this is still true today, 80 years later or so, need only consider that all the songs I listed a moment ago are released and marketed by one of the three multinational corporations who control 70% of the world's recorded music. Corporations for which these songs are sources of enormous profit rather than any sort of threat. In a similar vein, Theodor Adorno remarks that popular music is so bound up with consumption and amusement that attempts to outfit it with a new function remain entirely superficial, and that by taking the horrendous and making it somehow consumable, the protest song ends up wringing something like consumption qualities out of it. This is not so much to endorse these claims, but rather to say that there are significant there's a significant critical apparatus that opposes the notion of the kind of political song. Rancière goes further, arguing that so-called political art is often reactionary insofar as its mode of address is inherently anti-democratic. It sets up a hierarchy of knowledge that treats the viewer or listener as an ignorant party that needs to be edified and shaken from its stupor. These criticisms prompt an alternative position. Artist and theorist Ito Steyrl marks the contrast. A standard way of relating politics to art assumes that art represents political issues in one way or another, writes Steyrl. But there's a much more interesting perspective. The politics of the field of art as a place of work. Simply look at what it does rather than what it shows. And this gives us the following proposal. That music or sound is political insofar as it resists exploitation in its production, performance, distribution, and reception. Many have argued, for example, that free improvisation, I'm just choosing one musical example among many, that free improvisational music is political in this sense. So, for example, critic Ben Watson writes that free improvisation is almost by definition outsider music, opposed to capitalist business as usual. Improvisers want to explore the possibilities of the instant in this space using these instruments with this audience, or lack of it. Free improvisation doesn't guarantee any particular sound or mood. It produces a question mark rather than a commodity. Of course, if it's true that, as improviser Eddie Prevost writes, free improvisation is a form of music which counters the ethos which characterizes capitalism, it does so only in the most local of circumstances, for the relatively small group of players and audience members who attend to its fleeting sounds. Beyond this particular example, though, we might think of musicians or sound artists as political insofar as they attend to the conditions of their labor, to how their work is appropriated by institutions and circulates within contemporary systems of power. As Jean-Luc Godard famously put it, apropos film, the problem is not to make political films, but to make films politically. So think, for example, of the decision by several artists to withdraw their work from the current, almost completed, almost finished Whitney Biennial in protest of the museum's refusal to address the fact that one of its board members, Warren Kanders, is the CEO of a company that manufactures tear gas that's been used against migrants in Tijuana and protesters in Cairo, Gaza, and elsewhere. So attention to the conditions of artistic labor is surely important, I think, but the question is, what political work can be done by the work of art, by the musical piece, by the sound installation? And this leads, I think, to a third proposal, which is associated with the work of Jacques Rancière, but I think we can broaden it out a little bit, that music or sound is political insofar as it alters the dominant modes of perception, that is, of what or who is heard and by whom. Every society, every configuration of power, and thus politics, partitions the sensible, divides the sensible domain. That is, it explicitly or implicitly organizes the perceptual world and the sensorium, determining what can be seen and heard by whom, in what context, spaces, and times, what languages are officially spoken and understood, where and by whom, what sounds and images are proper or improper, offensive and inoffensive, intelligible and unintelligible, music or noise. In this sense, music or sound is political insofar as it creates dissensus, not consensus, contributing to a rift in the established order of the sensible. And though it's framed in somewhat different terms, this is precisely, I think, what Jacques Attali was after in his book, Noise, The Political Economy of Music. For Attali, politics is the struggle between order on the one hand and disorder and violence on the other. And this distinction between order and disorder is sonically prefigured in the distinction between music and noise. So Attali writes, more than colors and forms, it's sounds and their arrangements that fashion societies. With noise is born disorder and its opposite the world. With music is born power and its opposite subversion. In noise can be read all the codes of life, the relations among human beings. For music or sound to be political, then, is to challenge the established distribution of the audible, the division between what is considered music or intelligible sound and noise. So I'd like to push this idea further, considering sound in its local and global circulation today. And to deepen our sense of politics and the political and to set the stage for a discussion of the politics of sound, I want to take a brief detour through the news headlines, at least the news headlines in the United States, although obviously there are variants in Europe as well. So in the past year alone, hundreds and thousands of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers have streamed toward the US-Mexico border, leaving their lives in Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and elsewhere to escape poverty and violence and to seek economic, political, and personal security in the United States. Years of drought intensified by climate change, economic insecurity exacerbated by free trade agreements, gang extortion enabled by family separation, and entrenched cultures of corruption fueled by a combination of intervention and inaction by the very country toward which these migrants flee. All this and more provokes individuals and families to make the perilous trip north. Anyone with a US passport, a seasonal worker visa, a border crossing card, or enough money to buy a tourist visa can pass through one of the 48 official ports of entry on the US-Mexico border, or fly into an American airport, experiencing only the relatively minor inconvenience of long lines and bureaucratic scrutiny. Those who arrive at the border without the requisite papers, however, confront the decision to apply for asylum at a border checkpoint, or attempt a legal passage across the treacherous Rio Grande, or rugged mountain and desert territory monitored by border patrol agents and vigilantes. Some migrants are refused entry and returned to Mexico to await a hearing in American immigration courts. Others are placed in detention in the US. Many are sent back to their cultures of origin. The current US immigration policy is driven by right-wing nationalists who recoil at the demographic prediction that the country will be majority non-white by the year 2045, and who fear an influx of poor brown people who in need of protection and government assistance. A minority view is held by globalists and free traders in the Trump administration who favor a more porous border and the easing of tariffs, arguing that greater flows of labor, goods, and capital will benefit the market economy, for which nation-states and their territorial outlines are either irrelevant or impediments. This rejection of borders is shared by the No One is Illegal movement, which, however, objects to immigration controls on human rights grounds. All of this concerns politics in its original and deepest sense. After all, politics refers to the regulation of the polis, the city or state, and to the decision regarding who is a citizen of a politis and who is not. The term polis itself derives from the Indo-European root pella, which means citadel or fortified high place, and of course politics shares the same etymology as the term police. In short, politics deals fundamentally with borders and walls, the protection of those on the inside and the exclusion and the expulsion of others. Moreover, all this has a connection to sound. In ancient Greek, the antonym of politis, citizen, is barbaros or barbarian. Barbarian is one of those onomatopoetic words, equivalent to the English terms gibberish or babble, right, that refer to a foreigner whose speech is considered to be nonsense or noise, and who is thus deemed to be culturally inferior, uncivilized, or bestial, certainly not one of us. Now this returns us to the Rancierian and Attalian proposals for a politics of sound. Such a politics concerns which sounds count and which sounds don't, which are intelligible and which are gibberish, which are music and which are noise. But I want to go beyond these proposals to consider the politics of sound on the model of migration, that is, on the model of flows and codes, inclusions and exclusions. A rigorously materialist analysis of sound, I think, would consider it as one of the many flows that constitute matter in nature. Flows of matter, energy, and information that when captured, controlled, bound, or slowed down become the physical and social forms we know: mountains, organisms, languages, cultures, institutions, etc. These forms are only temporary coagulations or transitory hardenings of these flows, which constitute the basic reality of the world. On this model, the fundamental function of society is to code flows, for example, flows of food, goods, bodies, money, energy, garbage, etc. That is, to intercept them, to organize them, to regulate them, to channel them in particular directions, to impose meanings and limits on them, and the like. So a politics of sound would consider the local and global circulation of sound, its flow, capture, and blockage, the forces, technological, legal, economic, cultural, social, moral, linguistic, racial, gender, etc. The forces that accelerate, decelerate, and otherwise inflect it. It would ask, what are the forces that generate sonic flows or propel their movement and circulation? And what are the forces that constrain this sonic flux sufficiently to enable it to congeal into languages, musical styles, or scenes? And what are the forces that block, annul, or cancel these sonic flows? To develop this idea further, let's return to the politics of speech and consider the evolution of languages. I'm just going to take a quick detour here in order to shift us more toward contemporary artistic practices. So, think about what a language is, right? So a flow of air from the lungs vibrates the vocal cords, generating a sound that the larynx, tongue, palate, lips shape into distinct utterances. Some of these words are marked as significant through repetition and emerge as phonemes or words. Languages are sets of words and grammatical constructions that slowly accumulate within communities due to the pressures of isolation and through social norms and obligations. Within a community, these sounds and rules replicate like a virus, as William Burroughs famously put it, a virus contracted by one generation from the generation that precedes it. Just as genes replicate with variation, so too do languages. No two people speak alike, and subcommunities and regional groups manifest distinct variations in pronunciation, word choice, and grammar. As a result, every language is involved in a constant struggle between fixity and flow. Without some degree of fixity, there would be no language, but only a continuously varied flow of sound. Yet without the variation characteristic of spoken discourse, languages freeze or die. More broadly, every language is inhabited by idiolects, dialects, patois, slangs, and jargons that exert a centrifugal force, serving as engines of variation and difference that are counteracted by conservative centripetal forces that function to slow down this change. So the distinction between a language and a dialect is always political, a language consisting simply of patterns of utterance propagated and enforced by an elite or a dominant group. So take, for example, the evolution of Romance languages from Latin. During the Roman Empire, a relatively small minority with tremendous political, economic, military, and cultural power imposed Latin as the official language on a vast territory surrounding the Mediterranean Sea and beyond. Fixed in writing and disseminated in schools to young aristocrats, Latin was the language of government, courts, and the military, and of the most prestigious literature and music. The local variations of so-called vulgar Latin were tolerated in some regions and repressed in others. Nonetheless, Roman Latin remained the imperial norm and standard. However, with the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century and the large-scale migrations and incursions that followed, the linguistic variation characteristic of vulgar Latin accelerated, and a range of regional dialects began to develop and proliferate, forming a dialect continuum. By the end of the 7th century, classical Latin was no longer intelligible as a spoken language to the people of Romanized Europe. By the early 9th century, priests in France, for example, were ordered by the church to preach in vernacular languages. The development of major European cities at the beginning of the second millennium and the commercial revolution that accompanied it generated the need for written documents, contracts, licenses, inventories, wills, and thus for a greater supply of scribes than those proficient in classical Latin. So governments in the regional capitals, such as Paris, Florence, and Madrid, for example, began to codify their dialects into systems of writing that decelerated linguistic variation and established the unique linguistic identities of Gallo-Romance, Italo-Romance, and Hispano-Romance, for example, which eventually became French, Italian, and Spanish. Other Romance dialects, African Romance, and British Romance, for example, eventually disappeared, losing their competition with native dialects and those of conquering peoples. So later in the 16th century, the dialects of the regional capitals were further fixed by the academies of language that published official dictionaries, grammars, and pronunciation guidelines disseminated by schools, enforced by commercial and legal necessity, and solidified by the pressure of prestige. So the point of this extended example is to consider flows of sound, how flows of sound are released and constrained, accelerated and decelerated by social forces, by the variability and difference characteristic of the spoken word, by migrations that introduce new variations and conquests that suppress local or minor modes and impose a dominant mode of speaking, by commercial, legal, military, and ecclesiastical establishment of written forms of language that halt linguistic variation from above, and by the vernacular dialects, jargons, argots, patois, and slangs that continue to bubble up from below. This is sonic politics in a basic and deep sense. Not only is language a site of constant struggle between established forms of power and prestige on the one hand and subversive forces of vulgar speech on the other, this struggle has everything to do with migratory flows, borders, citizenship, and the police, determining who is inside and who is out, who is recognized as a legitimate member of the polis, and who has the status of a barbarian. To concretize these ideas and bring them into the present, I want to consider the work of Jordanian-British artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan. Associated with the London-based forensic architecture group, Abu Hamdan practices what he and his colleagues call forensic aesthetics, which aims to bring new material and aesthetic sensibilities to bear upon the legal and political implications of state violence, armed conflict, and climate change. Nearly all of Abu Hamdan's projects concern the politics of sound and listening. The work I have in mind is Conflicted Phonemes, an installation from 2012, made in collaboration with a group of linguists and immigrant rights activists, a graphic designer, and 9 Somali migrants who sought asylum in the Netherlands. Abu Hamdan's installation graphically charts efforts by Dutch immigration authorities to scrutinize asylum claims on the basis of the asylum speaker's linguistic accent, attempting to determine whether or not the subject is actually from a conflict zone and thus has a legitimate claim to asylum. Following a protocol prevalent since the 1980s in a host of European and Oceanic countries, immigration authorities recorded the voices of asylum seekers by telephone and then sent them for analysis to private companies subtracted by the government, in this case a Swedish company. These forensic linguists and phoneticians are asked to attend not to language, but to sound. The speaker may say one thing, but the expert listens to something else, namely to nonverbal effects that are byproducts of the event of language: pitch, accent, glottal stops, intonations, inflections, impediments. Here again, we have an effort to determine and police citizenship and legitimacy on the basis of sound. Yet, of course, this process is highly problematic, ignoring the complexities of global migration and the way its effects are registered in the voice. It ignores, for example, that phonetic borders are porous, that many migrants are bilingual, that many accumulate new words and patterns of speech in multilingual refugee camps, that refugees have often worked to conceal their origins for fear of persecution, that asylum seekers sometimes alter their dialect to be intelligible to their interpreters, and so on. Conflicted Phonemes attempts to track these in visual form, and this is a super complicated diagram, but I'll just take you through it really briefly, and if you want, I can share with you the PDF, which is, you can zoom in on it. So as part of the installation, a large blueprint marks the changes in 3 families of Somali dialects that are here listed along the side here. 3 Somali dialects in visual form. Over the 40 years of tumultuous history. From the adoption of the northern dialect, along the top there are these kind of key events in Somali history. From the adoption of the northern dialect, which is Maksa or Maksatiri or Nisom, as the official language of Somalia in 1972, through the refugee crisis of 2011. The print registers the linguistic consequences of forced education and intermarriage, military service, migrations due to war and famine, and experiences in diversely populated refugee camps. This visual presentation reveals the fluidity of language and of populations, demonstrating the futility of pinning either to a proper origin. This diachronic map is accompanied by a set of diagrams that for each one of the asylum seekers maps the variability of the applicant's vocal accent, the official verdict of the Dutch government, and an analysis and verdict by a contra expert. On one page, for example, we see that Mohammed adopts a variety of different accents and dialects depending on the person to whom he speaks. He speaks standard Somali to his mother, a mixture of standard Somali and a southern dialect with his father, a combination of Amharic and southern dialect with a fellow Somali pupil, and all three major dialects with fellow Somali asylum seekers. An accompanying page lists the applicant's self-reported origin, born in Mogadishu but raised 300 miles south in the lower Juba region, the verdict of the Dutch Immigration Authority, definitely not traceable to the speech community in South Somalia, and the more complex verdict of a counter-expert, as it says over on the right. He speaks Somali in its northern variety, which is spoken in the lower Juba region. Based on my analysis, it's highly certain that the applicant was socialized in a speech community in South Somalia. So Abu Handan's project graphically presents the results of social scientific research and political advocacy, yet it's presented as an art installation, was commissioned by an art institute, and has been shown primarily in art institutions and art museums and galleries. Like other forensic aesthetics projects, it operates at the intersection of politics and art, revealing the degree to which politics is always engaged in aesthetics, that is, in judgments with regard to sensation and questions concerning what or who is visible or audible and by whom. An artwork focused on sound, Conflicted Phonemes is political in the basic sense, concerning the deployment of sound to sort citizens from barbarians on the basis of the sounds or noises that they make. The sonic politics I've sketched so far has focused on speech and language, examining how the spoken word enables and restricts flows of flows of sounds and bodies. Yet over the past century or so, sound is circulated not only or even primarily by way of the living present voice or the live musical event, but more broadly by way of audio recording through a sequence of technological vessels, records, tapes, CDs, MP3s, and streaming audio, that vastly increase the spatial and temporal scope of sonic transmission and provoke new and different efforts to code and constrain it. A politics concerned with the local and global circulation of sound, its flow, capture, and blockage, the forces that accelerate and decelerate and inflect it. Such a politics must attend to the flows of recorded sound. So the history of audio recording is inseparable from the history of capitalism. Prior to the advent of audio recording, sound was entirely evanescent. As Hegel fittingly put it, it's a disappearance of the reality as soon as it is. The only means of registering sound or recording sound were biological. Funneled through the ear, sound was filtered by the brain according to evolutionary and cultural schemata that determined their significance for survival or social membership, and that were ingrained by repetition and habit. Virtual systems, for example, grammatical rules, song structures, etc., shaped sonic flows into memes that facilitated their replication and transmission to future generations. All these processes coded or territorialized sound, that is, they captured and they organized its flow, enabling it to accumulate as a cultural stock. At the same time, however, they facilitated a certain deterritorialization of sound, transporting it beyond the here and now of its transient sounding. The temporal and spatial extension of these sonic forms introduced variant repetition, copying errors, or mutation that caused them to change or drift, and we see this in the evolution of, say, an oral poem, right? Oral languages and traditional songs were collective products, anonymous creations of a whole community over several generations, constituting a sort of cultural commons. The bodies and generations through which they passed serves as relays, points of connection, and transmission of their sonic flows. The emergence of capitalism in early modern Europe demanded new and different forms of capture, particularly for the capture of musical flows. It sought, for example, to fix music as a commodity, a thing that could be bought and sold for profit. To achieve this, capitalism initially repurposed a tool that had existed for centuries as a mnemonic device for musicians and performers, musical notation. So just as the institution of writing decelerated the variation of spoken language, the musical score arrested the flow of sound in the form of graphic symbols on a page. The reification of music enabled it to circulate as an exchangeable commodity. No longer an anonymous collective creation, music became a form of private property protected by a new tool of the bourgeoisie, copyright, which legally restrained the flow or reproducibility of the score and the performances it determined. In addition to its use value, music was now endowed with an exchange value, a properly economic value. Musical notation initiated new forms of musical territorialization, submitting sound to a symbolic code that required musical literacy and thus made it the province of a specialized class that regulated its flow. Notation fixed music in the form of an authorized document to which performers were held accountable and thus restricted the musical drift that characterized folk musics or oral musics. Yet the score was also an agent of deterritorialization, allowing music to travel widely in space and time, to be transported far beyond the cultural context of its creation. The advent of electronic audio recording intensified these codings of sonic flows and initiated new forms of deterritorialization as well. Electronic inscription captured sound in exchangeable containers and thus perfected the reification and commodification that was initiated by the musical score. At the same time, it dispensed with the requirement of musical literacy, allowing music to be actualized by anyone with an appropriate playback device. Where the score routed music through the detour of a visual code, audio recording delivered actual sounds and performances, and not merely musical sound, but any and all sound, or any and all sound that could be recorded. Not only did this vastly expand the domain of sonic art, giving us things like sound art, it upset linear temporality and historicity as well. Sound recording extracts a sonic surface from a segment of the past and gives it a virtual existence that isn't exhausted by playback in the present. It generates a vast, discontinuous sonic archive in which wildly heterogeneous sounds collide, overlap, and coalesce. Capitalism has an ambivalent relationship to flows and codes. On the one hand, it's a powerful agent of deterritorialization, unleashing flows of all kinds. Capitalism freed labor from serfdom, from attachment to the land, and from distinction between qualitatively different kinds of work, transforming labor into the fluid and exchangeable commodity labor power. And it tore wealth from landed property and set it into circulation as abstract capital. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels marvel at this deterritorialization of capitalism, its constant revolutionizing of production, its uninterrupted disturbance of all social relations, the everlasting uncertainty and agitation that distinguished it from all previous social and economic formations. Under capitalism, they write in a famous passage, all fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that's solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. Yet this tendency toward deterritorialization and the unleashing of flows is restrained by another tendency. Capitalism must ensure that these flows are reterritorialized into money, that profit can be extracted from them. The history of audio recording amply reveals this dual tendency of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, flow and capture. Again, the invention of electronic audio recording did something extraordinary, transforming an evanescent sonic process into an object, capturing and reifying sound as an exchangeable commodity. At the same time, this encapsulated sound enabled it to travel widely. Every new recording format has accelerated the velocity and range of this flow. The portability and circulation of sound was massively increased, for example, in the 1960s with the advent of the cassette tape, which enabled listeners to hear their favorite sounds while traveling down the freeway, or after the invention of the Walkman in 1979, anywhere at all. The portability of cassettes fostered the development of international tape trading networks, global communities of musicians and artists who traded one-off or small batch recordings and mixes on cassettes via alternative music zines. An eminent read-write format, the cassette lent itself to piracy and samizdat purposes. Recording industry associations in the US and Great Britain were sufficiently worried that they mounted media campaigns against home taping, initiated lawsuits to halt the practice, and sought a tax on blank tapes. For the most part, these efforts proved unsuccessful. Nevertheless, over the course of the 80s, the cassette became the most lucrative format for the recording industry, which by the end of the decade was dominated by 5 multinational corporations whose revenues from recorded music, at least in the United States, were steadily rising by nearly $1 billion annually. The introduction of even more portable compact discs in the mid-'80s allowed these profits to increase exponentially, reaching $14.6 billion by 1999. Within less than a decade, however, the recording industry had all but collapsed, thanks largely to the emergence of MP3 and digital file sharing networks, and later to YouTube, SoundCloud, and other platforms that delivered a staggering quantity and variety of free music on demand to anyone with an internet connection. Again, the major labels sought to halt this flow, successfully shutting down the file-sharing network Napster, suing individual users, and flooding peer-to-peer networks with spoofed files. But the unregulated flow of digital music continued unabated. CD sales plummeted, as did overall revenues for recorded music. By the 2000 to 2010s, major label artists such as Prince, Radiohead, Nine Inch Nails, and U2 were giving away their music for free. And in 2017, Chance the Rapper won 3 Grammy Awards for a hip-hop mixtape he distributed online free of charge without the support of any record label. All this prompted cultural theorists such as Dietrich Dietrichson and Björn Gottstein, and musicians such as Eckhard Ehlers to speak of a post-economic music, a phrase that registered both that recorded music had become essentially free, and that as a result, musicians and composers could no longer make a living through their music. Economist Jacques Attali agreed, arguing that the advent of MP3 inaugurated a post-scarcity culture in which recorded music lost all economic value while retaining its cultural, social, and affective power. Once again, however, capitalism found a way to restrict the flow. By 2016, recording industry revenues were once again on the rise, thanks largely to Spotify, a music streaming service invented by a former audio pirate. Spotify's solution was to stop selling things to consumers and instead to rent streams to subscribers, or to pay for those streams through advertising on the older model of commercial radio or TV. Despite Spotify's promise to inspire human creativity by enabling 1 million artists to live off their art, just over a quarter of artists made any money from streaming in 2018, and the median amount was $100. Capitalism seems to have found a way to halt the flow of sound, or rather to route that flow through its mechanism of profit extraction. Even so, music and sound today travel faster and lighter, with less contextual baggage and less monetary value than ever before. All this facilitates the proliferation, mutation, and circulation of hybrid and synthetic musics that combine global influences with local or indigenous forms. Digital platforms and networks provide easy access to these musics, which are often homemade and produced with cheap, relatively available equipment. More music and sound is available to more people than ever before, and more people are making more of these sounds as well. So I quickly digress to a brief case study. Kidal is a trans-Saharan trading hub in northern Mali, traversed by Berber nomads, commercial truck drivers, smugglers, refugees, and migrants headed to North Africa, Europe, or the West African coast. In 2010, most of these travelers and urban locals were equipped with knockoff cell phones that served a myriad of functions, prominent among which was to store and trade MP3s. These collections were extraordinarily wide-ranging and diverse. American classic rock and European technopop shared space with Bollywood and Nollywood film music, Angolan Kuduro, Bamako hip-hop, Tuareg desert blues, Balani show music, Algerian rai, Ivoirian coupé décalé, and other regional musics recorded with cheap or pirated technology in home studios, sometimes directly to cell phones. Audio files were traded phone to phone via Bluetooth networks that didn't require internet or phone service, which in the Sahel are spotty and expensive if they exist at all. Or they were produced from cell phone dealers or telechargers who downloaded songs from cell phones brought in for repair. 2 years later, in around 2012, Islamist rebels had taken over the region and imposed Sharia law, banning music and destroying cell phone towers to halt this musical exchange. Prominent Malian musicians sought exile in Algeria or moved southwest to the capital Bamako, where the Islamist presence was weaker. With all its flows and cuts, relays, and blockages, the Saharan cell phone culture exemplifies how sound moves in the early 21st century. The digitization of music unleashed powerful forces of deterritorialization, allowing sound to flow with unprecedented ease and speed, spreading mainstream culture across the globe, while also facilitating the development of highly local, hybrid scenes and subcultures. This flow can be restrained or blocked by conservative forces such as radical Islam, state firewalls, or the occasional content moderation of social media platforms such as YouTube. But as Marx and Engels noted 170 years ago, the tendency of global capitalism is toward massive deterritorialization and decoding. Capitalism annihilates all codes and instead operates by way of an axiomatic that translates all concrete particular qualities into abstract quantities and ultimately into the universal equivalent, money. Anything goes so long as it sells. Again, though, capitalism recoils against its inherent tendency. It tolerates deterritorialization only so long as it can profit from it, generating a surplus value of flow. MP3 pushed the music industry to this brink and threatened it with dissolution. Marx's prophecy seemed to have been fulfilled. It appeared that capitalism had invented a technology that undermined its own property relations, a technology that fostered unlimited mobility and eliminated the scarcity necessary for the generation of economic value. Yet music streaming services revealed capitalism's power of reterritorialization. Platforms such as Spotify reasserted the ability of capitalism to stockpile sound and fabricate value hierarchies through the gatekeeping of editorial playlists. They offered the consumer what piracy promised, easy access to a vast quantity of the world's recorded music, while enabling the music industry to extract a surplus value from every stream. Moreover, streaming exemplifies the new form of power that's been called control society, surveillance capitalism, or algorithmic power. Like Facebook and Google, music streaming services not only derive monetary value from sonic flows, they also mine affective and behavioral data, enabling affective modulation and the sale of behavioral futures. In response to these conditions, some artists attempted to return to the economy of the object, revalorizing the vinyl record, the homemade cassette, the limited edition release. At the same time, artists find themselves compelled to reinvest in the aura and presence of live performance and touring. Prominent critics of surveillance capitalism see new legal regulations and restrictions as the solution to its extraction of free labor and invasions of privacy. But there's another solution, not to return to older models of aesthetic value, but to accelerate capitalism's tendency toward decoding and deterritorialization, to push it further than it's willing to go. This was the solution of early hip-hop and sampling artists from John Oswald to Maria Chavez, to extract music from its commercial flow, to alter it, and to release it back into the sonic flux, free of its commodity status. And this is how music circulates around the world today, via digital networks, Bluetooth and cell phone connections, pirate radio stations, sound systems. The solution is not to return to earlier moments in the history of the sonic flux, but to strengthen and extend these networks, developing new technologies that liberate sound from the capitalist axiomatic and increase the spread and speed of its flow. So I want to say just a few things just to wrap up. I began by suggesting that the fundamental site of politics is the border, the site at which determinations are made about which bodies and goods can pass and which are refused. The border functions as a filtering mechanism that works via coding operations concretized in passports, visas, permits, bills of lading, certificates of origin, and so on. Through these determinations, though these determinations, inclusions, and exclusions are as old as the polis itself, the mechanisms of border control we experience today are actually the inventions of the 19th and early 20th centuries, responses to the deterritorialization of labor by capitalism and the invention of new means of conveyance, releasing workers from their sort of local territories to move elsewhere in the world to look for work. Yet the new policing borders and the erection of more powerful fortifications are symptoms of the increasing obsolescence of these physical borders. As political theorist Wendy Brown has argued, the proliferation of borders in the world today is precisely a result of waning state sovereignty in the face of globalization, which aspires to the frictionless circulation of goods and capital, if not people. Paper passports are rapidly being replaced by data profiles. Borders are becoming increasingly immaterial and ubiquitous, and citizenship is becoming more and more algorithmic. As journalist Atossa Araxia Abrahamian puts it, borders today have become overlapping and concentric circles that change size, shape, and texture depending on who or what is trying to pass through. We saw that sound plays a crucial role in these processes of filtering and coding, separating the citizen or legitimate claimant from the barbarian. The resurgence of right-wing nationalism, the obsession with border walls, and the institution of monolingualism will ensure that the spoken word remains an important site for sonic politics. Yet we also have to attend to the movements of sound and music across borders, nodes, and inflection points of the datascape, the ways that flows of music and sound are permitted or halted, captured and mined, employed as data points in the profiles that increasingly determine our place and our capacity for movement within the circuits of corporate and political power. Thanks. So I know I went on a bit long, but hopefully you have some energy for comments, questions, objections.
Thank you so much, Christoph.
Pleasure.
Wonderful talk and keynote pushing us towards the flux and politics and flows. Any questions? We have, yes.
The long march.
Thank you for citing Wisława Szymborska, because I'm from Poland.
The Polish contingent, yeah.
And it's fascinating because it's at some point Szymborska was criticized for being part of the socialist literary circle, sort of collaborating with the power. And some of the critics say that she's the most digestible for English-speaking language poet. And I was wondering, because some of the theories, I would say, always enables the sort of contra voice to the dominant. And because the same time of the poem is sort of Julia Kristeva's notion, she had this series of interview called Revolt, she said, where she states that sort of downsizing the revolt into a politics is betraying its movement. And sort of only the movement of self-critical is the rebel one. So it's sort of, for me, connects with there are politics, but the rebel is something else. And I was wondering, especially with the phonemes element and the Latin dominant and the new Latin of English dominance, did you ever encounter sort of the Bergsonian noise of another language, like Eastern European, and sort of entities as well, works of art that didn't go through the English language formation of being sound art or being English language, because even on the notion of kuduro, it's like pre-prepared music for larger distribution into the English language circuit. So I'm wondering how would you deal with the other circuits that are the white noise that didn't go through the access point in the global circuit of capital that you're speaking about the flow.
Yeah, well, a whole bunch of interesting questions there. I mean, one of the wonderful things about this conference is the wide range of its participants, right? Wide geographical range, who are oddly constrained to speak in English, at least when they're standing on a stage. But what's wonderful about it, in a way, at least for this English speaker, is to hear that range of. I mean, everybody here speaks this language, whatever I put this in quotation marks, right? This is the dominant tongue of the world, for better or worse, and yet speaks in a particular way, right? Speaks with a particular accent, and of course that's what Hamdan's project is explicitly about, because it's not at all about what someone says, right? It's entirely about those noise elements of language, right? We say, oh no, you speak a northern Somali accent, but you say you're from southern Somalia, right? So it's all about the accents, and an accent is all about, I don't know, I'm not a linguist, but about those noise elements, right? Those fricatives and plosives or whatever, right? So it seems to me that the question of the status of the barbarian, at least in that project, is exactly not do you speak the dominant language, but how do you speak it? Yeah, and the Szymborska question is complicated. I'll maybe leave that to the side, but yeah. Also criticized for being an apolitical poet too later on, and yet we have that line: apolitical poems are political too. Yeah.
Hi. Wonderful talk. And I just wanted to ask you, there's a lot of debates, especially in the States, about political correctness and the use of language, and Jordan Peterson becoming famous of refusing to have this prescriptive use of pronouns and all this. So I just want you to know what's your take on these efforts to change language that are more prescriptive and doing it, with initiatives as opposed to how language has been evolving kind of naturally or collectively. So I just wanted to know what's your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example. It's a great set of examples about the politics of language and that sort of dialectic or tension between kind of flow and capture. Because on the one hand, there are terms that are held tightly by particular groups, I think. The self-description as queer, for example, right? Or, as we say in English, right, the N-word, right? Which certain groups of people can utter, and other groups of people can't. I mean, and that there's a political strategy there of inclusion and exclusion, but also, right? And so sub-communities have that, larger communities have it, then, alternative pronouns. I mean, the one that emerges, right, as emerging as the dominant is they, right? There's a New York Times, Farhad Manjoo, who's a New York Times commentator, came out like, I'm a straight white guy. I think he said he's not white, but I'm a straight guy, and I want to be referred to as they, and I think everybody should, right? And he's writing this in the New York Times, whatever. So anyway, hegemonic and non-hegemonic, this becomes a tension, and the question there is, you say, well, how do people want to be addressed, right? In the beginning of all our classes, I don't know, you all probably do this too, right? We go around and say, tell me your name and tell me your preferred pronouns, right? And so we address people. Yeah. So these are complicated, but they're political questions in that really straightforward sense of inclusion, exclusion. Yeah. Hope that explains it. Yeah. Sorry, Morton.
Yeah.
You'd like the microphone elevator.
Thank you. My question has to do with sort of the end of your talk. I'm thinking about the interest in acceleration, because of course the sort of accelerationist point of view has its pluses and minuses in different ways.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you could also speculate a bit about shifts in tempo in general. So acceleration, but also is there a place for duration or slowness, or is that another strategy for sort of gumming up the works or for undertaking things in a different way? And maybe none of these as sort of singular approaches, but is there a rhythmic metaphor we could employ here, or an arrhythmic metaphor we might want to reach for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, there's a gesture toward accelerationism, right, as a movement, and this is a longer story that I'll just touch on really quickly, and I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. But I mean, I do think that there is a so the tendency, so how to put it quickly, okay. So accelerationism as a political movement poses itself against what it calls folk politics, right? And folk politics is, and the key example there is something like Occupy Wall Street, right? Which said, move toward very low-tech methods of dissemination of information and knowledge. And acceleration wants to say, worries about that tendency because it's incapable of dealing with global capital flows and power. And so, I want to kind of endorse that accelerationist strategy because I think it's the tendency of capitalism, and then if we push that further, perhaps there's a political possibility there, and also to use the tools and materials generated by capital, right? So so there it was just, what do we do with, so in the musical context, what do we do with these flows? I mean, so one strategy is, we only self-release work and we release them on LP, and these kinds of, and I don't object to that, right? But I mean, but still, I don't, as a long-term political strategy, I wonder about that. But your question, the sort of question that came out of that's really interesting. It's a question of rhythms and flows, and that's what all these things are about. I mean, say, if you take a scene, for example, a musical scene, right? You take kuduro or something like that, right? Certain kinds of instruments and and instruments and musicians and whatever flow into a particular, cultural context. In Angola, for example, congeal into something like a scene, into something like a music that has right, and then it emerges and it blows up in the kind of global dance scene, and then it folds or collapses or morphs into other things, right? And so there's always going to be a rhythm, and I think that sort of total acceleration, total deterritorialization leaves us with something like nonsense. I mean nonsense in an absolute sense, but it's in a way, the question is a little bit like, descending into total silence or total noise. I mean, those are kind of conceptual distinctions. So I think what you're saying, a kind of a sort of rhythmic version of that, right? Maybe like, Henri Lefebvre's, like rhythm analysis, or we could sort of map sonic flows in terms of those kind of rhythms, right? Yeah, I don't know. That was. I feel like I kind of repeated your question, which is such a good one, with a slightly bit more detail or something. Anyway, so thanks for the question.